Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Nick. This week's episode, I'm going to try and demystify the making of drawers for cabinets and furniture. Let's get started. It always seems to start out with material selection, and I had a bunch of 3/4 inch thick aspen laying around, so that's what I ended up using. More often than not, drawers are made out of either 1/2 inch or 5/8 inch thick material. I started by squaring up one end of each of the boards, and then I could cut them to length with my table saw sled. If you want more info on the table saw sled, click on the screen or check a link in the description. Figuring out the lengths to your drawer pieces can sometimes be tricky, so let's take a look at it. Your front and also back piece are going to be the same exact length when you cut those to size, and it's really easy to figure out. Find your final drawer dimension and how wide you want it to be. Subtract your material thickness. If it's 3/4, subtract 3/4, and that's your front and back length. So say you had a 15 inch wide drawer with 3/4 inch material, you would cut your front and back to 14¼ inches long. If you had 5/8 inch thick material, you'd cut your front and back pieces to 14 3/8 inches long. This works so long as in the later milling operations, you make all your depths of cut to half of the material thickness. Then we can work on cutting the sides to length, and those you cut however long you want your drawer to be deep. Then it comes time to actually milling up the side pieces themselves. Here's a picture of the drawer, and if we slide over a little bit, we can see an exploded view, or more importantly, the side, focusing particular on the full width dado on the back of the side. I set up a dado stack in my table saw. All a dado stack is 2 outer kind of full-size blades with chippers in between. I make sure to set the width of that dado stack to the exact width of my material. Then I can slide my fence over. In this case, I just slid it over so that there was a 1/2 inch gap between the blade and the fence, and then I could start making some cuts. I like to make test cuts on pieces just to make sure that I have everything exactly dialed in. The depth of the dado stack is half the material thickness. That's crucial if you're going to follow the math that I explained earlier. The test fits together nicely, so now we can move from that full width dado on the side and focus more on the narrower dado on the front. That front joint I always call a tongue and dado joint. I switch out my dado stack to be 3/8 inch, and then I can slide my fence over using my material so that my material is flush with the left side of the dado stack. That way I know I'll have my dado stack positioned exactly where I want it. Then I'll make some test cuts. Then I go ahead and perform the cuts. I use a push block to keep the material down nice and flat. The longer the material though, you definitely can utilize a miter gauge so that you're not tipping the material into the blade and causing kickback. Ultimately, this is what your side should look like at this point. Now, let's move our attention from the sides over to the front piece, to where we're going to cut that rabbet. I then installed a board to be a sacrificial fence, and then slid my fence over 3/8 of an inch, so 3/8 inch wide of the dado was exposed, and then I had my blade set to just under 3/8 of an inch. I could then run a test board through it, creating that rabbet, and seeing if that would fit in the cuts I created earlier. It didn't quite fit, so I just slightly raised my blade just to take a very small amount off, and then I was dialed in and perfect. Then I could proceed to making all the cuts on my actual pieces. These pieces are a little bit longer, so I did employ a miter gauge to help so that I didn't have any kickback. Testing out my finished pieces, and it was perfect. Moving our attention now back to the very back piece of the drawer. There's not really much milling that goes on here, so at this point we just cut it to length. I could then focus in on the 1/4 inch groove that'll go on the bottom edge of each of the pieces. I switched back to my regular blade and made sure that my blade was positioned so that there was a 1/2 inch material hanging on the bottom of my pieces. Then I moved my fence over ever so slightly and made another pass. After doing so, I took this piece over to my material that I was going to use for my bottom panels and checked to make sure that it was going to fit. Not too tight, but a nice good fit. So now my back pieces were done. One thing to note on the front piece, you want that groove to be on the opposite side of the rabbets you cut earlier. And as far as the side pieces, you want to make sure that they're mirror image of one another. You don't want to make two lefts or two rights. So that you want to definitely pay attention to. And then I could cut my bottom panels to size. To get that size, I like to clamp up my box just in some clamps with no glue, and then measure the bottom panel, making sure to measure and account for that 3/8 inch or half your material depth groove in the bottom. Then I typically just subtract anywhere from, say, about 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 less than the actual size. That gives the panel a little bit of wiggle room. And then definitely double check, dry fit your pieces, make sure everything fits, that the panel fits, and everything clamps nicely, and all the joints fit nicely together. I don't know how many times I've done this before to where I skipped this step and for whatever reason my panel was just a hair too big or one joint just didn't quite fit. This is where you can fine tune it and then you don't have glue on it. So definitely don't skip that step. Then I moved on to sanding. I sand all my pieces lightly to about 180 or 220. I like to take a sanding sponge and actually knock off some of the fuzzies and the sharp corners on some of the dados and grooves. And then I come back and I knock off the outside corners as well. Don't be too aggressive on your sanding here because the certain portions that are going to fit into the dados are already kind of sized to fit. So you don't want to make the joints any looser than they need to be. I had everything all sized up before I started gluing, and I was all ready to go. I had everything I needed right at hand. I could then just take my pieces apart, apply glue and make sure it was evenly spread out on each side of the joint, and start assembling my parts, making sure that my top and bottom edge was nice and flush. Oftentimes I hear about people having problems with their glue ups, and I think it has to do with lack of preparation. You only have so much time to work with the glue, and unless you know everything's going to fit properly, then you could run into some real big problems. Then it's just a matter of sliding that panel in, getting the glue on the rest of the joints, and getting everything nice and tight together. I also like to have some scrap pieces of either the material that I'm working with or even a softer material so that the clamps don't leave as many dents or impressions on the workpiece. Then a couple clamps on the bottom side, and then I also put in those scrap pieces. I also put a couple clamps along the top, and I also did check it to make sure it was square. You can either measure with diagonals or a combination square, and then I snug all the clamps up nice and tight. Any type of glue that I can access, I'll wipe off with a rag, but if some of it I couldn't get to because a clamp was covering it, I just take a chisel to get the bulk of it off, and then during my finish sanding, everything comes out nice and smooth. I don't always apply finish to the drawers. However, in this case, it was going to be a TV stand, and I figured it might get a little bit more abuse, and it's kind of in a public space to the home typically. So I just wanted at least 1 or 2 coats of wipe-on polyurethane so that it was nice and easy to clean up in the future. If you guys care to hear more about my finishing process on these particular drawers, I'll leave a link in the description for that as well. Once the finish is cured overnight, I come back with a 320 grit sanding sponge and just knock off any of the high spots, make sure that the finish is nice and smooth. Well, I hope that answers some of the questions you guys may have had when it comes to drawer construction. A couple caveats, however. This particular method is one of probably dozens of different ways in which to construct a drawer. Known as tongue and dado joinery, it's kind of my go-to or fallback method. Why? Because it doesn't take a ton of effort to get awesome looking results. The glue joints themselves are super strong, and it lends itself nicely to having false drawer fronts. And that's actually what I'm going to be using this particular set for. You want to have your hand at hand-cut dovetails, or with a router, or miter joints with splines, or finger joints to make a box joint. Those are all good to have as skills, but this is kind of a basis of making drawers. Another thing that is crucial that I note, I'm using 3/4 inch thick material. A lot of times guys will build their drawers out of 1/2 inch or 5/8 material. Anytime I mentioned a groove, a dado, a rabbet, anything like that, those measurements are based on half the thickness of your material. So if you're using 1/2 inch, your groove will be 1/4 inch deep. Or if you're using 5/8 thick material, your rabbet is going to be 5/16 by 5/16. That's if you want to use the math in which to get all the lengths to everything, and that just ensures for a nice strong joint, and it makes it real easy to calculate everything. So definitely worth noting on that. All I got to do with those now is install them. And in this particular case, I'm going to use these over travel drawer slides that are ball bearing based. They hold a ton of weight, and I like that they're an over travel. That way you get to see the complete back and see all the contents to the drawer. But that's a video for another day. As always, I appreciate you guys stopping by. This is really kind of awesome that I get to do these videos. And if you want to help out the show directly, definitely look into checking me out on Patreon. And if you want to share me on your favorite social media, that definitely helps these videos out a ton. Any comments or questions you may have, put those down below. And until I see you guys next time, you guys, take care. Well, I hope that answers some of the questions you guys may have had when it comes to drawer construction. Editor guy, what's up with that? They know you know how to do animations. They were riddled throughout the video. I'm trying to do the outro. Man, you give a guy a new mouse and he's...